He's a convicted felon.
He is also an informant for the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
I don't think everything you got him.
You cop.
Yo, freeze! That's where I can see him, NYPD.
This is bad business.
Get back to prison.
If anyone can get drugs inside, it's you.
If you go back inside, you'll never get out.
Not gonna tell me, huh?
Back up! I will kill him right now. Back the fuck up. Fuck that. Stay the fuck back. Stay back. You fucking...
Please, Daddy, come back home. I'm scared.
I'm doing everything I can.
I'm coming for you.
I'm not getting out of this.
This ends now.
Surprise.
I'm explaining a film from 2019 titled The Informer. Spoilers ahead. Enjoy the content. The scene begins by revealing a man named Pete Kozlow. His cell phone rings, which is a call from the FBI informing them that their target will arrive soon with about 6 kilograms of fentanyl-type drugs. Not long after, it was the turn of another cell phone to ring. This time the call came from a fellow gangster named Stasek. They are talking about the arrival of their boss, including the drugs that will be smuggled later. Kozlow is also a responsible family man. He asked his wife to take their child for shelter elsewhere because the risk of his job was very dangerous. He also gave Sophia, his wife, a key and asked her not to open the door to anyone before he arrived home. At the same time, an FBI agent called Wilcox was providing orders to her men about the ambush that would be carried out on their target. Wilcox underlined that the policemen did not need to arrest or harm them. Instead, they had to wait for her instructions to begin the operation later. The next day, Kozlow carried out the action by seeing Stasek first and under the watch of Wilcox and her men, but she was perplexed since Stasek was conducting a meeting with the buyer, which was not included in the scenario that had been created previously. In the end, this made Wilcox have to follow the movement pattern of her target. Upon arrival at the transaction site, Kozlow found an oddity where the buyer didn't look like an addict and looked awkward. Kozlow feels the person with him is an undercover police officer who has no idea who Kozlow is. Kozlow also requested him to leave since his life was in danger, but the policeman did something unexpected. He pulled out a revolver and aimed it at Kozlow as a bluff. However, Stasek's shot managed to hit the policeman's torso, which irritated Kozlow because all of the scenarios he had prepared with Wilcox had failed. Kozlow instantly left with the pretext that he needed to smoke, which was a signal for Wilcox to secure the area right away. However, unexpected things happened because it turned out that Wilcox instead decided to leave the place. She withdrew her troops so as not to ambush the place. After cleaning up the police corpse, Kozlow now arrives at the headquarters of Richard Klimek, who is a drug lord. Following the earlier gunshot at the police, Klimek brutally attacks Stasek for disturbing his business. While Kozlow was prepared to be instructed by Klimek to submit himself to the police, he believed that doing so would prevent the previous shooting case from being probed too thoroughly by the police, which would eventually include him and destroy his company. Klimek also promised that Kozlow's prison time would be short since he had assembled a team of brilliant attorneys to defend him, but it came out that this plan was not just to cover up the previous case, but Klimek also wanted to convert Kozlow into a drug supplier in the prison. Unfortunately, it turned out that Klimek had detained Kozlow's wife and child so he couldn't refuse his request. Meanwhile, on a riverbank, the body of a former police officer named Daniel Gomez was found by Edward Grenz, who was Daniel's superior in his unit. In a different location, Kozlow is shown meeting with Wilcox, and he requests an explanation for the choice taken by the FBI agent during the previous shooting. Instead of receiving an explanation, Kozlow was accused for the shot that killed a police officer. Not only that, but Klimek's admission that he would imprison Kozlow pushed him even farther into the mission this time. Hearing all of that plainly irritated Kozlow. but he couldn't do much since Wilcox's bosses threatened him with a slew of lawsuits that appeared to indicate that Kozlow was Daniel's murderer. Kozlow, who feels cornered, can only accept that he will go to jail and become an informant for the FBI. But without anyone knowing, it turns out that Kozlow had anticipated everything. He recorded all his conversations with the FBI. While Edward is still unable to accept the deaths of his soldiers, he begins seeking information from someone he believes of being Daniel's murderer. He even assumed Kozlow was responsible for his men's deaths, but it was later proven that Kozlow was a former military and FBI informant. But Edward was still intrigued by the Kozlow person he suspected. One night, during the celebrations leading up to Kozlow's incarceration, it was discovered that Klimek had come with his wife to have supper with Kozlow and Sophia. Everything seemed normal, but what was interesting was that Edward had been stalking Kozlow's house before the event started, not only suspicious of the drug kingpin, but Edward was also confused when the next day he found Kozlow, who had been arrested by the police, in his yard. Edward went straight to Wilcox's office and inquired about the FBI's participation in Kozlow's release. To his understanding, Kozlow should still be serving his 20-year sentence, yet he has already been freed on parole after just spending 4 years. Furthermore, he discovered CCTV camera catches of Kozlow at the scene of Daniel's death, including a female figure in the automobile he mistook for Wilcox. Feeling cornered, Wilcox and his superiors could only remain silent when Edward was expressing everything.
Not gonna tell me, huh?
While being housed in a huge cell at the jail, Kozlow is shown being greeted by other convicts who recognize him as Klimek's guy. Meanwhile, in another place, Sophia is loading drugs into a dead dove, which is then flown by a drone and dropped right above the prison area. It turned out that all of this was a trick used by Klimek in distributing his drugs to the prison. The next day, while cleaning, Kozlow managed to retrieve the bird's carcass and place it in a garbage bag. Meanwhile, Edward, who is still doing his research, pays a visit to Sophia's business and instantly questions her about her husband's situation. But, allegedly, Sophia refused to be honest and instead booted Edward out of the store, since she didn't want anything worse to happen to her family. Then Edward went, leaving his business card in the hopes that Sophia would reconsider and call him if something happened to her. Edward also assures her that he will thoroughly investigate the case that happened to Kozlow and seek his release if Sophia wants to cooperate with him. Meanwhile, Kozlow, who was already in prison, started to distribute drugs and was approached by another gang named Vermin. He had just sought to establish communication between Edward and Kozlow. Edward then threatened that if he did not disclose any information about Daniel's death, another group would be waiting for him in prison. Soon after, Kozlow was brought to a room and savagely assaulted by other criminals, including one of the jail guards. They even hung Kozlow to hide the fact that he had committed suicide because he felt his life was in danger, so Kozlow revealed that he was an informant attempting to find out everything about Klimek. After hearing his confession, the black convicts finally let go of the rope that held Kozlow's neck. From this it was revealed that they were business rivals of the drug kingpin. Meanwhile, at the FBI headquarters, Wilcox and Keith Montgomery, her superiors, are panicked by Edward's action, who actually goes to the prison where Kozlow is being held. He had just sought to establish communication between Edward and Kozlow. Edward then threatened that if he did not disclose any information about Daniel's death, another group would be waiting for him in prison. Soon after, Kozlow was brought to a room and savagely assaulted by other criminals, including one of the jail guards. They even hung Kozlow to hide the fact that he had committed suicide because he felt his life was in danger, so Kozlow revealed that he was an informant attempting to find out everything about Klimek. Not wanting to continue arguing with his subordinates, Keith said that Wilcox's career could be seriously threatened and could even be jailed if she didn't kill Kozlow immediately. Because he thinks there will only be Wilcox and Kozlow's names in the document so that Keith won't be involved, this is where the cunning lies. Meanwhile, Kozlow, who had been successful in collecting the names engaged in Klimek's enterprise in prison, eventually notified Wilcox. However, Kozlow was instantly suspicious since Wilcox, who should have been overjoyed with the news, remained mute and did not respond. Kozlo, intrigued by what happened to the FBI, phoned his wife, who requested him to depart with their kid. Kozlo believes that someone has betrayed him. He also requests that Sophia use the key he provided him earlier, which turns out to be the key to open a box containing all of the recordings of discussions between Kozlo and the FBI thus far. Unfortunately, Sophia, who was opening the box, was suddenly visited by Wilcox. This corrupt FBI agent also immediately took all the tapes containing the recorded conversations and played them in the car. We don't know what got into her mind. Wilcox looked confused after getting the tape without her knowledge. Klimek, who knew Kozlo's actual identity, immediately called his men in prison to assassinate him. Kozlo was assaulted, but he managed to immobilize them. He even had the opportunity to make a mess by kidnapping a warden.
Back up! Yeah, man. I will kill him right now. Back the fuck up. Fuck that. Stay the fuck back. Stay back. You fucking...
Meanwhile, Stasek and other Klimek men have been spotted near Sophia, intending to murder Kozlo's wife and children by setting fire to the house. Fortunately, Edward arrived at the same time as the terrible action, and he too managed to shoot dead Klimek's men there, despite being injured in the leg. Meanwhile, Kozlo, who was besieged, cleverly exchanged his clothes for the uniform of the warden he was holding hostage. He managed to trick the officers. A moment later the sniper opened fire at the warden who had changed his clothes by Kozlo. They thought that the figure was Kozlo, even though it was Kozlo who was behind the warden's uniform. The shooting also caused an explosion in the gas cylinder that Kozlo had arranged ahead of time, and a large explosion was unavoidable from the room where Kozlo was. Kozlo, who was supposed to have died in the explosion, was discovered to be alive. Wilcox then took the initiative to release Kozlo by supplying him with a rifle, as though she was threatened by Kozlo. Wilcox was ordered to murder Kozlo again on one occasion after meeting Keith, but this time Wilcox did not hesitate to refuse. Wilcox had apparently been working with Edward since a lot of cops arrived shortly after and detained Keith. At the end of the film, Sophia and her child are seen in a city park. From a distance, Kozlo is secretly watching his wife and child, but unfortunately he can't get closer because there are a number of FBI agents following Sophia and her child. A moment later Edward approached Kozlo and gave him a passport and a number of files that would lead the former military man to hide in another place. Edward also said that Wilcox had promised to bring Kozlo together with his family, of course, when the situation was conducive, and the film ended. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to stay updated with recaps of our latest films. Your support would be appreciated. I hope to see you next time.